Hey everyone, this is Rahul with the Alternative Investors Hangout, and today we have a returning guest. He is my dad's second cousin. He is Amar. Amar, thanks for coming on again.
Thanks, Rahul, for having me again. It's great to be back.
Okay, we always talk about liberalism. Last time we talked about fascism. Now I want to get into communism and how basically it has infiltrated American policies. I would say as early as the 1900s, ever since the Federal Reserve was created, but we could discuss that at a later issue. And it just seems that there's been a tug-of-war between the ideas of John Locke and Rousseau of France, where John Locke was a free market individual talking about individualism, talking about private property, how that's important. And then on the other hand, we have Rousseau of France, who is a hardcore socialist who talks about getting away from those ideals that Locke talks about. And if you want to turn that to America now, we have to look at the fact that America, we have been following all these progressive ideals, which actually can be traced to the Communist Manifesto. So, Amar, could you begin this by telling us what's going on with the Communist Manifesto and how it pretty much infiltrated American policies ever since the 1900s?
Well, yeah, you raised some very, very interesting points in what you just said. You mentioned John Locke, you mentioned Jean-Jacques Rousseau, two philosophers from what's considered the Enlightenment period. We're talking 1600s and 1700s. Both Enlightenment philosophers who went in very different directions, as you mentioned. You mentioned liberalism, which I, of course, call leftism. More properly, liberalism was, in fact, the philosophy of John Locke, the philosophy of the Founding Fathers, that being classical liberalism, as we would call it today, to distinguish it from the socialist liberalism, which is simply socialism, but the term liberalism has been co-opted, as we've seen, or as it has been in much of the English-speaking world, perhaps with Australia as one exception, where the Liberal Party of Australia has views more in line with the policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan than it does with the policies of the left. But in general, that term has been co-opted. And, you mentioned Rousseau. Folks, when talking about the origins of the left, oftentimes will go back to Rousseau. Rousseau was one of the main inspirations that the Jacobin Club in the French Revolution was drawing from when they conducted their murderous reign of terror, which killed and executed in various ways over 40,000 people in France, people who were just not going along with the program, who were considered undesirable, and they were killed, many of them by the guillotine. This Jacobin Club revered Rousseau, and they promoted his ideas. But to really understand the origins of the left and why the left does what it does, I think we have to go back much further. I think we have to go back to the dawn of civilization itself and to a certain incident that happened approximately 500 years ago. Now, civilization, what is civilization? We can start from the basics here. Civilization, there are many definitions of it. Some would say that a civilization is a more urban society as opposed to a more rural society. That's one way of looking at it. Civilized, the term civilized can mean can indicate people who are more moral than people who are, say, barbarians. So civilized versus barbarian can be a duality that can be cited. When I think of civilization, as I approach many terms like liberalism, for example, I like to go back to the origins of these words. And the word civilization is derived from the Latin root word civis, which means simply citizen. Okay, so a civilization then is simply a collection of citizens. So the question then is, what's a citizen, and what are the qualities of a citizen? Philosophers throughout history all over the world have tried to tackle that. The Code of Hammurabi in ancient Babylonia had a concept of citizenship in which a good citizen was ultimately fair and honest in all of his business dealings, faithful to his spouse, supportive of his family, responsible for his debts, and trustworthy as a witness. So these were the qualities of a citizen. Confucius in China in the 6th century BC. And the Code of Hammurabi was from Babylonia. Confucius, he spoke of virtue as being one of the things that adorns what he calls the superior man, as opposed to the mean man. The superior man meaning a virtuous man, a good man, whose thoughts are sincere. And then we have Aristotle from ancient Greece, from the 4th century BC, who says, and I quote from his book, Politics, Book 3, Part 1, "He who has the power to take part in the deliberative or judicial administration of any state is said to be a citizen of that state." So how do we create citizens? Well, societies generally create citizens through 3 foundational pillars of civilization, as I call them. And they are, number 1, religion, number 2, marriage and family, and number 3, private property. So those 3, religion, marriage and family, and private property, 1, 2, and 3. Now, that's civilization. Now, we spoke of Rousseau. I believe to understand the origins of the left, we have to go back a few centuries before Rousseau. I think we have to go back, well, to the year 1492. Now, as we all know, in the year 1492, the Sistine Chapel was used for the first time to elect a pope. Of course, everyone knows that, right? That's what the year 1492 is known for. Okay, no, of course. There's something, no matter what happened, no matter what else happened in 1492, the French and the British and the English signing a peace treaty with each other, which also happened that year. All of those incidents are overshadowed by, of course, Columbus's arrival in the New World in that year. And that was a big turning point in world history and in the history of thought in general, and especially in the history of political thought in Europe. And we have to look to that year for the origins of leftism ultimately. Because, see, Europeans, they gained contact with this new group of people with lifestyles that they had never seen before, cultures that they had never come into contact before. And these were the Native Americans, also known as the American Indians, and their cultures became these objects of fascination and myth and legend. And these myths and legends and stories that oftentimes contained perhaps more than a few tall tales traveled back to Europe, and European thinkers were fascinated by this. Thomas More in England, who was the Lord Chancellor of England, in the year 1516, wrote his book Utopia, in which there was this perfect society located in the New World called Utopia, where there was no private property, among other things. It was a very elaborate sort of book sort of vision that he had for this utopia. But there was no private property, and it was located in the New World. Now, Thomas More never traveled to the New World, never traveled to North or South America, but he was going off of stories, off of myths and legends that he was hearing. And there was also the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, who lived in the 16th century. And he also began to idealize these people there in the Americas, these American Indians, as enjoying the state of primitive perfection or savage bliss, if you will. They were uncorrupted by religion and the forms of marriage and family and the lust for property and wealth, which, in his view, seemed to define European civilization. And so Montaigne, that's Michel de Montaigne, Montaigне, French gentleman and a very influential essayist, he himself began to question and criticize the very idea of civilization. That what is civilization? Is civilization really a good thing? When he compares what they had in Europe to these somewhat fanciful accounts of the American Indians. And then he wrote in an essay called On Cannibals in the year 1580, something about the American Indians. He described them this way, and I'm going to paraphrase this just a bit in the interest of time. He says, "This is a people, I would say to Plato being one of the main thinkers in the Western tradition, among whom there is no commerce at all, no knowledge of numbers, nor any judges, no political superiority, no riches, no poverty, no contracts, no inheritance, no divisions of property, no occupations but easy ones, no respect for any relationship except ordinary family ones, no clothes, no agriculture, no metal." And it goes on and on. How far his imaginary republic would be from such perfection. So Montaigne was viewing these people as being in this state of perfection, this primitive perfection, where there's no property, there is no political superiority. There's basically anarchy. There are no contracts. There's no agriculture. There's no commerce. No poverty, no riches. Everyone's on the same level, supposedly. Of course, this is not in accordance with reality. The American Indians certainly did have a concept of property. They certainly did have commerce and agriculture, most definitely. Corn, squash, beans, and tobacco, which became staple crops of the West, were created by the American Indians. But this was quite fanciful, and he saw them in a very idyllic way. And these distortions of the American Indians led to this mythical idea of the noble savage. People are probably familiar with the noble savage concept. So the noble savage is the counterpoint to European civilization, or civilization in general. And thinkers who were influenced by Montaigne and many of the Enlightenment thinkers, such as Rousseau, who were influenced by these accounts, people who had never actually met American Indians or been to the New World, started coming up with theories of their own, theories of civilization of their own. And Rousseau, who you mentioned, was from Switzerland. He was a French-speaking Swiss man who lived just in the 1700s. He assailed this concept of private property himself as being the basis of civilization, and he blamed private property for Europe's social inequality, for the crimes that people were experiencing in European society, and for the constant wars that were taking place in Europe, such as which became world wars, such as the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s, and the 7 Years' War in the 1750s, which in North America was the French and Indian War. So there's this there were these constant struggles and social inequalities and crimes and wars. And Rousseau thought, hey, if we just get rid of private property, we will solve these problems. Now, Rousseau was not attacking the other two pillars of civilization, those being religion and family. He was pro-religion and pro-family. I won't go into those, but he was attacking private property, and he was taking his cue, some of his inspiration from Michel de Montaigne, who was very influential upon his thought. And so then we have the French Revolution, which takes place. Out of the French Revolution comes the Jacobin Club, from which comes the left, and then the rest is history. So you see, leftism, why did leftism begin in Europe? Leftism was a response against civilization. It was it had a view of civilization as being essentially the disease of mankind. And if we can get rid of civilization as it exists and more closely approximate this sort of state of anarchy where there's no property and therefore no political superiority of any kind, such as what supposedly but didn't really exist among the American Indians, then mankind will be happy and everyone will be free and there will be no more social classes. Okay, so let's then fast forward just a few decades after the French Revolution to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto. Did you have any further, before we get into the Communist Manifesto, did you have any thoughts or comments on what I just said?
No, you pretty much nailed it over there. I mean, we could discuss later on about the 10 planks, which you're getting into right now.
Right. Yeah, sure. And I could just mention one thing. After the French Revolution, there was a group of thinkers known as the utopian socialists, or at least Karl Marx, decades later, would call them that. These were men, including Robert Owen from Wales, Britain, and Charles Fourier, and Henri de Saint-Simon from France. Both of them, Fourier and Saint-Simon, were both from France. They were definitely influences upon Marx and Engels, and all three of these men, in addition to other utopian socialists like Etienne Cabet, are mentioned in the Communist Manifesto, and they're very important to understand because these men, Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Henri de Saint-Simon, and Etienne Cabet, founded socialist colonies right here in the United States of America, starting in the 1820s, I believe. Robert Owen founded his socialist colony, one of his several, in the city of New Harmony in Indiana. Etienne Cabet founded one in the small town of Nauvoo, Illinois, and I could go on and on. But really, socialism has been in this country for a long time, at least since the 1820s. And they were attacking civilization. Charles Fourier called civilization a frightful dream. And Robert Owen, in his Declaration of Mental Independence, written 50 years exact to the day after the U.S. Declaration of Independence. He attacked, and I quote, "the trinity of evils responsible for all the world's misery and vice: traditional religion, conventional marriage, and private property." So those there, right there, are the three foundational pillars of civilization that he's calling the trinity of evils. And so that's very telling. So these men, they influenced the thought of Marx and Engels, but they were not wholly copied. What Marx and Engels were seeking to do in the Communist Manifesto was purify their philosophy and point out the fallacies in some of the other leftists of their day, including the utopian socialists, such as these people who I just mentioned. And getting into now the Communist Manifesto, well, it was written in the year 1848, I believe, in Germany. It was translated decades later into other languages, Russian and English and others. In chapter 2 of that book, well, I'll go with chapter 3, which is called Socialist and Communist Literature. You know, he is criticizing other forms of leftism, what he calls feudal socialism, among others, and then petty bourgeois socialism. So there's a bourgeois sort of socialism. Bourgeois, of course, is the middle class. It's a French term meaning the middle class. It's related to the English word burger, not burger, burgess, such as a house of burgesses, such as what existed in Virginia. So in chapter 2, though, the title of chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto is Proletarians and Communists. This was, of course, originally written in German, and I'll read from some paragraphs in there which lead up to the 10 principles of communism, which we'll then delve into. So I'll quote here from chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, beginning quote here. "The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production." Okay, so there's a sort of obsession with the so that's end quote right there. So there's an obsession with production, with the Industrial Revolution and the conflicts or the tensions between the old agrarian system and the new industrial economy that was taking shape in the 19th century, and they wanted to increase total productive forces. I don't quite understand from reading the Communist Manifesto why Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had any motivation to increase total productive forces, since they were trying to destroy private property altogether. Who would benefit from this? It's quite a mystery, but of course everything makes sense when we simply understand that all leftism is designed ultimately to destroy civilization by kicking out the three foundational pillars of civilization, those being religion, marriage and family, and private property. Everything makes sense. Everything that the left does makes sense when we look at it that way. In the way that the utopian socialists viewed their project. And the utopian socialists of the early 1800s were perhaps the last main leftist movement that was honest. They were open and honest about what they wanted to do. They simply wanted to destroy these pillars of civilization. After that, leftists became dishonest, and they had to hide things and speak of compassion for the worker and speak of the eternal class struggle, which is history itself, a class struggle and class warfare between the haves and have-nots, which supposedly in the 1800s manifested as a struggle between the bourgeoisie, the middle class industrialists, that is, and the proletariats, the poor working class. I hope I'm not losing you at this point.
No, you're not.
Okay. So now jumping into this. So now continuing on with the Communist Manifesto. So you see right there, they're saying they wanted despotic inroads on the rights of property. They believe in despotism. The leftist utopia for the communists is a dictatorship. Plain and simple. They're being very clear about that. Vladimir Lenin was very clear about that. Other communists were clear about that. So now returning to the Communist Manifesto, Chapter 2, beginning quote, "These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable." Okay, end quote. And then there are these 10 principles or 10 planks of communism. So we can go into each one after one, each of the 10, and then see if we can find any or talk about what we see in our country, and perhaps we can have a little conversation about that, which I think might be interesting.
Sure.
Okay, well, the first plank or the first principle of communism is, and I'll just quote, number 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Okay, so nobody will own any land, and all land will be used for public purposes, for the benefit of supposedly the proletariat, I guess. So one can think, and this has been said by others. I think others have delved into this and written their essays online that make comparisons between current American U.S. policy, that is, and these 10 planks of the Communist Party. To wit, well, since the left is all about abolishing private property, or at least undermining it and taking us to a point of abolishing it entirely, what do we see happening in our country? Well, we see the EPA, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, undermining people's property rights, using protection of the environment as a pretense to punish people for building on their own private property.
Do you think that has to deal with, sorry to interrupt, to deal with Agenda 21?
I think they're connected. I think they're definitely connected. I think that the left is using the environmentalist cause, which I believe is certainly a positive cause. There's nothing inherently wrong about it, but they're using it to promote the leftist agenda. And what is that leftist agenda? Well, it's to undermine, among other things, private property. And they do that quite effectively through, as you mentioned, Agenda 21, which I'll get into more, the EPA, this new project called the Blue Zones Project, which seems very similar to UN Agenda 21. Other things we see, municipal fees being required for rental properties, where if you have a property and you simply want to rent it out to another person, the owner, the owner, have to pay a fee to the municipal authorities. I mean, that's an increasing trend.
I mean, can't you say that the property taxes we pay are being redistributed to all these unions and their pensions?
Well, they're certainly going to the government. I might hesitate to say precisely where the money is going, but they may remember leftists are despotic, and despotic people lie, and they have no compunction about using a good cause and using positive sounding terminology to enact or promote their agenda. And they could be using monies for all these various other things, which I'll also get into the labor unions when we get into other planks. So the Blue Zones Project is another one designed to undermine private property, to tell people what they can and can't do with their land, where cars can and can't go. Okay, so those are some things. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, we can move on to the second one.
Okay, sure. Well, the second one is, I quote, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. And we actually see that here in the United States. So I'm quoting here some figures from the OECD, that being the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a group of, I believe, at this time, about 24 nations, including the United States, various other industrial nations as well, in Europe, in Asia, in the Pacific region, including New Zealand, Australia, and others. These are industrialized countries, and these figures I have, which are available online, show the progressivity of taxes in these countries. And the average for all 24 of the countries looks something like this. If we look at the top decile of income earners, that means the top 10% of income earners, for all of these 24 countries, on average, the top 10% of income earners earn, and I'm going to round the figures a bit, earn about 32% of all the income. Okay, so the top, that's a mistake, and I apologize. The top 10% earn about 28% of all the income. And they pay about 32% of all the income taxes. So 28% versus 32%. Okay, 28 and 32, they're not too far off. I think that it's a ratio of 1.11. Okay, so they're not terribly far. It's close to 1, close to a 1-to-1 ratio. However, when we go to the United States, the top 10% of income earners, the richest decile, earns about 34% of all of the income, yet they pay 45% of all of the income taxes. Okay, so 34% versus 45%. And that's a ratio of 1.35. And that ratio is the highest among all of the OECD countries. So clearly, among all these industrialized countries, the United States has the most progressive tax system among them all. And that's something to take note of. Actually, Switzerland has one of the lowest. The top 10% of income earners earn 23.5% of all the income, and they pay 20.9%, about 21% of all the taxes.
Yep.
So,
and then on a side note, so if you look at the 16th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in 1913, you have to look at the fact that we had a 0% tax rate before that. And after that, we have a huge tax rate, and as a result, you're seeing all these businesses move offshore, and people are blaming big businesses, or they're blaming all these capitalists, but at the same time, if you have higher taxes and you have all these regulations, the jobs are going to go offshore.
Certainly, and they're simply responding to a stimulus put there by the government itself.
Indeed. Okay, let's look on to the third plank, or the third ideal of the Communist Manifesto, and it's basically the abolition of all rights of inheritance.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so rights of inheritance. Well, this, again, is to undermine private property. And I must say, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels that's Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, they are very upfront about the fact that communism seeks to abolish private property. So this is just one more aspect of that abolition of private property. That's abolition of all rights of inheritance. Well, in the U.S., among other things, we have what's called a death tax, also known as, more properly, the federal estate tax. As of now, there was in 2001 there was the death tax repeal law. Then in 2009 there was a fight over that, and now we're back with the death tax. And the total assets worth over $1 million will be taxed at a rate of 55%. As when the property transfers from one generation to the next.
And the thing about the death tax is that a lot of these small business owners get screwed over. So suppose it's a family business and they inherit a business over $1 million. Well, they have to pay a tax of 50%, or if it's a couple $1 million, and that would make their company go out of business because they would have to sell all their inventory. And this is what the leftists don't understand, like Obama. He said that he wants to share the wealth, but if you share the wealth, then you're going to destroy some of these small businesses. So they're living in their own dreamland.
Oh, yeah, but the thing is, it's I think destroying businesses is kind of the idea. I mean, not kind of the idea, it is the idea. And I think that the real hardcore leftists, such as those in academia, they know that the purpose is to destroy private property, to undermine it, attack it, and abolish it. And they get spirited people to join their cause without realizing that spirited people who like the idea of private property, but who unwittingly go along with this program. And so, yeah, there are folks on the left who are unwitting participants in leftism, very spirited ones, very enthusiastic ones, but they don't quite realize that ultimately it is they themselves who will be hurt, by these policies. And then, of course, there are the real intellectual hardcore leftists in academia who are just rubbing their hands together, saying, excellent, this is exactly, it's working just as we planned. Folks like those from the Frankfurt School, the Marxist Frankfurt School, who populated the universities of our country with leftists, generations of leftists. So yeah, we have the death tax. That's certainly undermining the rights of inheritance. So were there any other thoughts you had on that?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, the next one then is number 4. That would be confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Okay, immigrants and rebels. These are terms that we typically don't use nowadays. I think the gist of this principle is the confiscation of basically the punishment of all those who don't go along with the communist program. We don't go along with what the government has in store for the people. Rebels, immigrants. Well, we can look at what are our current policies here. Our current tax policies, for example. We're seeing more and more nowadays Americans living abroad seeking to renounce their U.S. citizenship. I have an article here from Yahoo Finance, or actually from Business Week, where it says the government is chasing away potential job creators to other countries with increasing U.S. tax reporting requirements. U.S. accounting costs alone are around $2,000 per year for a U.S. citizen residing abroad. As a result, the number of Americans renouncing their U.S. citizenship has surged 6-fold in the second quarter of 2013 from a year earlier, as the government introduces tougher asset disclosure rules. So people are being punished for living abroad and working abroad and earning money abroad, creating jobs abroad, and they're being discouraged from bringing that capital back to the U.S. In various ways. So that's
and they're taxed.
And they're taxed on that income. Absolutely.
So it's double taxation.
Correct. And that's one of the ways in which they're discouraged from using the capital that they earn. So there's an increase in foreign governments, such as in Switzerland, in these governments assisting our government, the U.S. government, in locating these folks who are hiding their money and not paying those taxes. So as a result, people are simply renouncing their U.S. citizenship, and they're essentially becoming effectively immigrants and rebels, in a sense.
Right. And then another thing to add is that you have a lot of these Swiss banks and foreign banks. They don't want to deal with American citizens. That's kind of discouraging, but I believe in free flow of capital, but you don't have that with these progressives.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is the case. So did you have any other thoughts on that?
No. Let's move on to the fifth one. This is my forte. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So basically getting down to this, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and ever since that was created, we've had this warfare/welfare state. And as a result of this, over time, we, number one, have two incomes raising a family. Back in the day, it used to take one bread earner to feed a family. Now it takes two. And this is what the left, such as, I mean, I know you don't call them the left, but...
Well, I do call them the left.
Okay.
I don't call them liberals.
Okay. And if you have guys like Krugman, Stiglitz, all these Nobel Prize winners, they never complain about the Federal Reserve lowering our living standards. And that's what it's doing. They may say, hey, we have great technology, but at the same time, it takes less of our money, or what we have is less money in our pockets because of that. We have less cash flow because of what the Federal Reserve is doing. And they're against the warfare state, but at the same time, the Federal Reserve allows an elastic currency, meaning that they could spend more than they can, and that's what they do with the military and then with all these welfare programs such as Obamacare, which is a disaster.
Oh, very clearly a disaster, yes. And if we look at Obamacare, well, we go back to first principles, knowing that the left seeks to attack, undermine, and destroy the three foundational pillars of civilization: religion, marriage and family, and private property. Obamacare does all three. In Obamacare, everybody has to pay for so-called reproductive health care services, those being abortion services, morning after pills, and so forth, that many people would object to because of their religious beliefs. So that's undermining religion. Then there's marriage and family. Well, Obamacare has it has a very huge, a very sizable marriage penalty in it. Those who are married will pay much higher premiums than those who are not married, and it's encouraging people to get divorced and simply cohabit with each other, and hence the breakup, yet another stimulus to the breakup of marriages. And there are many stimuli for the breakup of marriages in our country, all instigated by leftist policies and feminist policies in welfare and elsewhere. But that's a different topic for another time. And then private property, well, obviously with Obamacare, we're all paying more and getting fewer services, for fewer health services for the same money. And that's undermining our ability to gain capital and to do other things with it, build this economy, start businesses, put people to work. So Obamacare is a triple whammy. It's a triple threat. It accomplishes all three of the things that leftism seeks to accomplish: attacking, undermining, and destroying those three foundational pillars of civilization, which are, can you name them, Rahul?
Going against family, marriage, and then the other one is religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got most of them. There's religion, there's family and marriage, which you had, and then private property, the big one.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is what communism centers itself on. And you mentioned the central bank, the Federal Reserve Bank. It's interesting when we look at the history of central banks in America. At the time of the founding of this country, there was the Bank of North America. It was a private business chartered bank, and it was opened by the Continental Congress. It went away in a few years, and then a few years later, there was the first Bank of the United States. Alexander Hamilton was a proponent of this, and in 1818, it too went away. It was done away with. And then there was the second Bank of the United States, which was done away with under Andrew Jackson. And there's plenty to say about Andrew Jackson. But then decades later, we, of course, as you mentioned, in 1913, gained the Federal Reserve System and the various issues which it has caused, which you outlined for us.
Indeed. And then one last thing about Obamacare. I don't know if you've heard about this and people listening. I just saw this on Newsmax.com. Obamacare is targeting volunteer fire departments. So there you go. That's another whammy of Obamacare.
Yeah,
way to go, President Obama.
Volunteer fire. That's terrible. For those who work, who protect us from fires, deserve much better, I believe. And these are volunteers. Now, what is volunteerism? Volunteerism is an aspect of citizenship, what we might call civic virtue. I mean, what our founders would call civic virtue. Civic virtue, which is essentially people caring for other people, people taking an active interest an active personal interest in the well-being of their community and their fellow citizens, is essential for maintaining freedom in a republic. In a dictatorship, you don't have that because you've got a dictator doing everything. In a republic where people have natural rights and the government exists to uphold, in theory, the natural and the substantive and substantive rights, which are natural rights, and the procedural rights of all the people, of all the citizens, civic virtue is essential. People have to care for each other. If we don't take care of each other, like these volunteer fire department folks, then we will just get more government, and more government means less freedom. And that's a whole different topic, but we're broaching many aspects of it. So you see, it is without really realizing it. You see, the leftism works on many levels. It started out as a domino effect of people seeking to destroy civilization, and it manifests in many different ways. And people who are proponents of leftist policies may not realize that they're actually undermining civilization, these three pillars of civilization. They don't realize it. They just think it's a good idea. But the academic types, they know it because they've read these utopian socialists. They've read the Communist Manifesto and the writings of other leftists. And they know what this is really all about. And if you have any other comments on that, we can address them. Otherwise,
no, I'm good with that.
Okay. Well, the next plank was number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of states. So communication and transport. seems to me we don't have this overtly. People may point to the FCC, the Department of Transportation. I don't see them necessarily as being established for centralizing communication or centralizing transportation, but for setting standards, at least initially setting standards and working towards public safety and norms of public decency when it comes to the FCC and other things like that. However, there is Agenda 21, as we discussed earlier. UN Agenda 21, that the 21 refers to the 21st century. I believe it originated in the early 90s. It was a series of supposedly non-binding principles for sustainability, quote unquote, sustainability, building a sustainable society. And among those, among the means of reaching the sustainable development sort of state was achieving a more sustainable population, basically population control. And that's just overtly stated in the document, in the Agenda 21 document that I believe was created in Rio in 1992 under the auspices of the UN. So in Agenda 21, there is a clear push to control transportation, to move people, to center the population around places where there is a lot of public transportation, to make houses smaller so that more people could fit in a smaller place, smaller space, so that less space will be taken up. And yeah, it's all being done under the guise of environmentalism and being kind to wildlife and so forth. But the ultimate goal is to undermine private property and to control transportation. So we don't have full centralization, I think, in this country, but we have made step towards it, full centralization towards the means of communication and transportation. But it's not quite over it just yet, not as it was in the Soviet Union, certainly. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Wouldn't Agenda 21 deal with the seventh plank?
Well, why don't we just go on to the seventh plank then, and address that. So the seventh plank is, I quote, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Okay, so this is an interesting one. I think the gist of this is, again, government ownership and control of capital, in this case being the capital being the land, and instruments of production and factories. Okay, so there are a lot of things that are being discussed in plank number 7. Now, improvement of the soil generally. Well, this is an interesting one in that in California, which is entirely run by the left, represented by the Democrat Party in this in the state of California, there is in the Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, if one drives up and down Interstate 5, one can see signs along the way where there is a lot of farmland, but a lot of wasteland as well. Welcome signs that read "Welcome to the Congress-created Dust Bowl," and what that's in reference to is the fact that there are very huge swaths of land in the Central Valley of California which are not being used, ostensibly because use of that land would endanger certain wildlife. For example, certain fish, the Delta smelt, for example, is often mentioned, and so that land is not being used. So in a sense, is that bringing into cultivation wastelands, or is that creating wastelands? It's hard to tell, but there's definitely an interest on the part of the policymakers who are behind these such policies to control the use of land and what land will be used and what land will not be used and how it will be used. So they've made steps in that direction, again, under the guise of environmentalism and caring for wildlife. Now, government ownership and control of capital. Well, there is one classic example of that in America, which does deal with the environment, and that would be, of course, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which came into being under FDR. Now, FDR, was he a leftist? I see him more as a fascist. I cited in our last discussion the book by Wolfgang Scheibel-Busch, 3 New Deals, published in 2006. I'd recommend it to all our listeners. He goes into detail about the Tennessee Valley Authority, but in America, that would be an example of a corporation that is owned outright by the federal government. And it does deal very, very intimately with the environment. We're talking about locks and dams and rivers, control of the rivers, and so forth. I don't have a great deal of detailed knowledge on that, but that would be an example of that. Did you have any comments you wanted to add to that?
Nope.
Okay. So, we're just going through each one and adding our thoughts to them. And I hope the listeners will chime in on their own and offer their thoughts. I guess we can move that on then to number 8, plank number 8, and that is equal liability of all to work or to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So industrial armies and everyone being accountable to work, meaning essentially labor unions. Now, what we have in the U.S., we can go on and on about how labor was dealt with in communist countries in Europe and elsewhere. But in the U.S., well, we can look at labor unions. Now, the fact is, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, overall union membership is at just about an all-time low in this country at this time. What's interesting is that a majority of union members in this country are members of public employee unions rather than private employee unions or unions from private industries such as the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters, and others. So while overall union membership has gone down, mainly in the private sector, we are seeing a tremendous increase in union membership in the public sector. So where it was dying on the one hand, politicians, leftists essentially, sought to boost union membership in the public sector to increase the power of government essentially. And so we see some interesting statistics here. I'm just flipping through them at the moment. Overall union membership as of 2012 was 11.3%, which was down from 11.8% the year before. Yet a majority of union members are definitely in the public sector. And these public sector unions, I'm not here to bash unions per se. I think unions definitely have a place, but in the public sector, they can be very caustic on a state's finances, as they have been in the state of California, for example, and in other states. And California has, the number of hundreds of billions in unfunded liabilities is constantly going up. The estimates are always changing and increasing. Years ago, the figure of $500 billion in unfunded mandates to the various public employee unions in the forms of pensions and benefits.
And you know what the most idiotic thing they're doing in California is they're continuing to raise taxes, especially those who are rich, and then the rich are just going to Texas. And if you look at it, don't you guys pay like a 10% income tax or something like that? Something ridiculous?
Sales tax is close to 10% at this time.
What about income tax? What is it there?
It's on the order. I think the highest bracket is right around
like 10 or 11, right?
Something right around there, yes.
Yeah, I was listening on Michael Savage's show one day, and he was saying that for the ultra-rich, I think they have to pay a 1% mental tax for the state income tax. So it's quite ridiculous when it comes to that. And then if you look at Illinois, the unfunded liabilities are out of control, and that's due to union pensions as well. So, yeah, you're absolutely correct on what you're talking about when it comes to public sector unions. And if you look at it, FDR was against public sector unions.
Right.
At least he even understood that. Mm-hmm. As less as he was.
That's right. Well, and I say it was more, economically fascist, but certainly a statist, actually federal workers became unionized by executive order under President John F. Kennedy. So that's a fact.
Oh, I never knew that. Wow, I thought he was a conservative president for a Democrat. That's weird.
Yeah, he was anti-communist, and there are many, I think, positive things about President Kennedy. However, he did, by executive order, create the possibility for federal public employee unions.
Wow.
And
never knew that.
And this thing spiraled out of control from there over time. So yes, while overall union membership is at a historic low.
Wait, hold on a second. You said federal, so it's not statewide.
Oh yeah, well he was president of the United States, so he could only deal with federal employees.
Yeah,
No
okay.
authority
So that doesn't really mean anything with the states,
correct.
though.
No, they're absolutely correct. You're right to point that out. These are two different worlds. One is federal, one is state. That's correct. But at the state level, we're also seeing problems caused by public sector unions. So shall we move on to the next one, or did you have any other comments to add to that?
Yeah, I have no comments for that.
Okay. Number 9, combination of agriculture, so this is from the Communist Manifesto, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. Okay, so agriculture, manufacturing industries, this is again the sort of obsession of the communists of the 1800s, where people were going from an agrarian society to a more manufacturing and industrial society. There's this conflict taking place, but I think the overall gist of this is population control. And we brought up Agenda 21, which is certainly about population controls when it comes to transportation, the movement and locations of the population, where people will live, where they won't live. Agenda 21, there's a growing opposition to it on both the Democrat and the Republican side, both conservatives and leftists. Some people who are on the left, who side with the left, I should say, but who are not necessarily leftists, they are coming to the realization that Agenda 21 can be a very injurious to people's rights of property, to their natural rights. But so there's Agenda 21, Section 1 of which talks about achieving a more sustainable population. But there's also in California this high-speed rail line, which is a case study, an interesting case study. So I believe it was in 2008. There was a bond measure to create this high-speed rail line, about $10 billion, supposedly. Later estimates, went much higher than that, many times higher than the initial $10 billion that was sold to the people. It did pass. Now this high-speed rail line, well, it's for California, yet if one looks at the map of this proposed rail line, it mainly services 2 metropolitan areas, and those being the San Francisco Bay Area and the Los Angeles area, and obviously cities in between, and the Los Angeles area including LA County and Orange County, and just the metropolitan areas. And a high-speed rail line, well, is that altogether necessary? Why is that needed in an age where telecommuting, for example, is becoming more prevalent? Where, well, I guess not a great number of people work in LA and live in the Bay Area, or vice versa. People generally live within 20, 30 miles of where they work. Their workplace and their living space is usually close together. So a high-speed rail line covering all of California, one wonders what's the real agenda behind it when it's mainly servicing 2 metropolitan areas and various locations in between. So there's this fascination with controlling transportation and controlling the population and having a sustainable development and growth in population. Sustainable, by sustainable, they mean no growth in population, negative growth in population. That's what they really mean by sustainable. They are misanthropes. They wish to see fewer human beings on this world. Of course, they themselves will never volunteer to be eliminated for that purpose. But it'll always be other people. The other people are the undesirable ones. So leftists, they should not be eliminated. They should not have their rights curtailed. Only the others should have their rights curtailed. I believe it was P.G. O'Rourke who used who had the quote, population control is about one thing. There are too many of them, but just enough of us. So
do you think what they're doing in Japan or what's happening in Japan is going to just happen here with just slow population growth, just like in Europe?
I don't know. Obviously, right now with the current economic conditions, we are seeing a slower growth in the population. Fewer children are being born at this time. I don't know though. It's hard to predict the future on that. I do think Americans are still an optimistic people, and optimistic people tend to have children. They want to work hard to pass good things down to their children and to future generations to make the world a better place. I do believe we still have that ethos here in our country, and whether or not that goes away may be subject of another discussion.
Indeed.
All
right. Let's go to the 10th one.
Yes. 10th one: free education for all in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc. And that's a direct quote from the Communist Manifesto, complete with the et ceteras. Well, if we look at our country, if we look at public school enrollment, approximately 90% of all students, K through 12 students in our country, are enrolled in public schools. 90%. 10% are in other types of schools. Now, that 90% includes some who are in public schools that may be charter schools, but that's a small percentage. The vast majority are in public schools that are compulsory, that are dictated to the families as far as where they shall attend, and there's frankly very little choice in that for families. But that's free education for you. And now, of course, abolition of children's factory labor. Obviously, we are all for that. We are all for abolishing children's factory labor and treating human beings as cogs in a machine, of course. Now, a combination of education with industrial production. This is again that fascination with industrial production on the part of Marx and Engels and the communists. Industrial production for what exactly? What are people looking forward to? What are people building? If there's no private property, if no one is supposedly profiting from it, what's the motivation for industrial production? Well, they're silent on that. In this entire Communist Manifesto, that is never even addressed. Why there should be industrial production in the first place, other than the fact that it's something that the communists want to control through despotic means. They say it outright in this Communist Manifesto. So that was free education. And other aspects of education. Did you have any thoughts to share on that?
Yeah, when it comes to education, you have to look at these teachers who feel entitled to, number one, pensions, which are redistributed from ordinary taxpayers like us. So I think that's a huge problem as well. I mean, when you have free education indoctrinating the students, the teachers expect something out of it. I mean, a lot of these teachers I talk to think that they're owed something because they're public sector employees. Right.
Because they're helping society as a whole. And in fact, well, obviously one of the biggest public sector employee unions is the teachers union, or union, generally speaking, and the teachers unions, speaking collectively. They are very well funded and quite powerful and influential in state governments.
Indeed. One last thing I wanted to talk about this, though. When it comes to what happens in our school system, they don't teach us about finance and economics as much, or finance and accounting. And if people simply understood our debt-based system, how the Federal Reserve System works, and how it's pretty much screwed over the middle class over the past 97 years or 100 years, where people have lost 97% of their purchasing power, then they could realize the problems. And then people are just lost, saying that, oh, the taxes are so low for the rich. That's the excuse that they're going to come up with. They're going to listen to these guys at the New York Times talk about it. But if they had a financial education in their schools to teach them about this, then I think a lot of people would be better off right now. And because they don't know this, and since the public school system does not teach us about basic finance and accounting, I think a lot of people, number one, have been given a disservice, and I think it was done on purpose.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the gap has to be filled by us. We have to be the educators. We have to do things such as what you're doing with this broadcast, educating people. But financial education and economic education should be brought to children right where they are in schools. I would suggest that people who are knowledgeable about these subjects and who want to make a difference see if they can volunteer to be a guest speaker at a school, maybe for 5th or 6th graders. I think that would be excellent. Teach them about money in a fun way, in a way that children can understand. And I think one should leave it at that and not bring up other things like foreign policy and conspiracy theories and so forth. Just keep it pure and simple. Let's talk about how money works. Let's talk about financial planning for the future, how the banking system works, and the history of it, and what existed before and what exists now, very simply, and what we can do about it. And at least plant some seeds in these young people's minds. That's something that I think is really incumbent upon us. It's part of what was mentioned earlier, what I was saying about civic virtue. We have to care about our fellow citizens, care about them enough to seek to enlighten them, to give them information that they need to make good decisions for their lives and for our country.
I totally agree. And when you mentioned the thing about conspiracy theories, I bet a lot of my fans are into the conspiracy theories when it comes to the Fed, but I'm just going to leave it at that when it comes to the Fed and conspiracy theories. But anyways,
everybody knows that the Fed was founded by aliens from Jupiter. Okay, I mean the evidence is in Area 51, and the Illuminati are behind the whole thing.
And same thing with the Rothschilds, right?
Well, of course, right.
Alrighty. And Amar, before I let you go, is there a way that people could contact you, or you don't feel comfortable with that right now?
Oh, I'm very comfortable. I'm the most comfortable person on earth. How about that? No, absolutely. If folks would like to email me, I think there were some requests for this. I can be reached at my email address, which is asalgia@yahoo.com. That is A as in Apple, S as in Sam, ALGIA @yahoo.com.
Awesome, Amar. Thanks for this podcast. I appreciate it and your time.
And I thank you, and I thank you for your time. And if I may close on one point on capitalism. Just remember that capitalism is simply economic liberty for all people. It is our unalienable right of free enterprise. It is your right to prosper from your hard work and your ideas, the capital that you create. And if we talk about capitalism in that way, rather than talking in terms of the Laffer curve and corporations and employment and innovation, but put it on the level of a human being and that person's rights and that person's dreams and aspirations, we can do a better job of inspiring people with our founding principles.
Indeed. And speaking of the Laffer curve, that curve is correct, though. If you do cut taxes, you are going to get more revenue in production. So.
Not to knock it, but I'm just saying we need to personalize these important concepts.
All righty. Thanks for coming on again, Amar.
Okay. Thank you, Rahul. Really appreciate it.